This is part 2 of the plant nutrition series. We ended part 1 with the question of what else were plants using besides water for their growth. They were gaining more weight than the weight of water used, so they must be using something else in the environment to grow. Stephen Hales is going to advance our understanding here, and he speculates that that something else might be in the air. Now, before we get to his clever experiment, let's now take a moment to look at the molecular structure of some of the things involved. In the 1800s, chemists began to discover that there was a lot of carbon in plant tissue. Today, we know that the carbon exists as atoms of carbon in molecules such as glucose. And this is a glucose molecule. The black atoms here are the carbon atoms, the blue ones are oxygen atoms, and the white ones are hydrogen atoms. So this is a molecule of glucose. It's an energy molecule, and we will learn that plants are producing this molecule in a process called photosynthesis. But it's important to note here that glucose is composed of 3 different kinds of atoms: oxygen atoms, hydrogen atoms, and carbon atoms. So this is a molecule. Molecules are composed of atoms that are chemically bonded. The white pipes are chemical bonds between these atoms. A chemical bond is when atoms are sharing electrons. Now, from part 1, recall that we said plants appeared to be using water as a source of material substance with which to grow. But if we look at the molecular structure of water, we see 1 atom of oxygen and 2 of hydrogen. Notice there's no carbon here, right? So from a molecular standpoint, it would be impossible to build a glucose molecule from just water molecules. There's no carbon in water. Glucose molecules have carbon atoms, water molecules do not, so you couldn't use only water to build glucose. Now, these considerations were not, Hales was not privy to, the molecular structure of these compounds, but he is going to do an experiment to test whether something else besides water is involved. It's just, at this point, we should suspect that whatever else the plant is using ought to have carbon in it, because a lot of carbon is found in plant tissue, and water does not have carbon atoms. Okay, so what is the source of the carbon? And here, today we know that in the air are molecules of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a gas. It's composed of a carbon atom double bonded to 2 oxygen atoms. So this is CO2, carbon dioxide. And this is the substance that plants are using as a source of carbon. So eventually we will get to the point that our final understanding of what plants are doing is that they're going to be using these 2 simple molecules, water molecules and carbon dioxide molecules, to make glucose. But at this point in history, Hales was trying to gather evidence that something in the air was a building material for plant tissue. Okay, to understand Stephen Hales' experiment, we have to learn a little bit about the physics of air and water. Now, consider this diagram here. We have a pan of water, and we have a simple jar, an empty jar, and we're going to invert it. So here's the opening of the jar here. Now, the little black dots would be air molecules. Well, what is air? It's a mixture of various gases, mostly nitrogen and oxygen and some carbon dioxide and some other things. But the dots would be air molecules, and the arrow would indicate the direction of motion of a particular air molecule. And so we can imagine that these air molecules are bumping around in all different directions. Some of them will be bumping into each other, some will be hitting the wall of the jar, some will be hitting the surface of the water. And the force per unit area of those air molecules hitting the water molecules, the force per unit area is called pressure. So we can think of air as exerting pressure on the surface of the water here, in addition to pressure on the surface of the jar as well. Well, that air pressure is going to tend to push the water down, but as in response to that pressure, the water is going to move up inside the jar. That's the only way it can move. It can respond to that force. So as the air pushes down on the water on the outside of the jar, right, the water is going to be pushed up inside the jar. So the outside pressure is going to force the water into the jar. But remember, since we simply turned over the jar, there was air inside the jar. And so there are air molecules bumping around to the walls of the jar, but also bumping into the surface of the water here. So there's going to be pressure inside the jar forcing the water down. So we've got two competing forces here. We've got the pressure outside the jar pushing the water up in the jar, and we got the pressure inside the jar pushing the water down. Now, if the water level inside the jar is the same as the water level outside the jar, well, that would happen when the outside pressure is equal to the inside pressure. And if we just simply turn the jar over, then the inside pressure will be about the same as the outside pressure. And so we should not see the water level inside to be very different from the water level outside. Now let's do a little trick here with our jar. Let's put a hole in it and connect it to a vacuum pump. And so we're going to suck the air out of the inside of the jar. Notice, as we remove air, there will be less pressure, right, inside the jar. So less force being exerted on the surface of the water. And so the outside air pressure, which has not changed, will be able to push that water higher up into the jar. So if we evacuate all the air, the water will rise to some maximum height. In fact, this is how a barometer works. It measures air pressure. So the higher the outside air pressure, the higher the water will be pushed up. So in other words, you're sort of measuring the weight of the air by comparing it to the weight of the volume of water that gets pushed up inside this jar. Now we're ready to understand Hales's experiment. By the way, we should do one more experiment. Back to this situation here, we could imagine if the outside air pressure increases, of course, that's going to then cause the water level inside to go up, because then the outside air pressure will be greater than the inside air pressure, so the water level will go higher. And with the vacuum, it's the opposite. If we reduce the air pressure inside, the water level will go higher because the same outside air pressure can now push it up higher because we've removed the air inside the jar. All right, we're now ready to look at Hales's experiment. All right, let's take a look at this scene up here. What Hales is going to do, he's going to put a plant in the jar. Right? Now notice the approach here. He suspects that the plant might be absorbing something from the air. Well, if the plant will absorb something from the air, that might affect the inside air pressure, and therefore might have an impact on the water level, right, compared to the outside. So a clever approach here. Now, in actuality, this is sort of gets complicated, but the simple idea here can be seen with this slide here. What he did was he put the plant in here and then waited several days. And when he looked at the water level after several days, he found that the jar that had a plant in it, the water level was higher. It had been raised. Now, remember, there are two possibilities for this. It could be that the outside air pressure in those several days, the outside air pressure increased. Maybe a new, the weather changed, and so the air pressure changed, and so if the outside air pressure increased, it would just push that water higher up into the jar. Or it could be that the inside air pressure was decreased somehow. Perhaps the plant was absorbing something. If the inside air pressure were decreased, then there's less air here to push down, so the same outside air pressure can push the water higher. So we have two possible interpretations or explanations for the higher water level. Critically, Hales had a control condition. Notice down here in the control condition, there's no plant in the chamber. The air in the chamber was the same as the air pressure outside the chamber on the original day. Now, if the outside air pressure had changed, right? Let's say the outside air pressure increased because the weather was changing. Well, the control condition should have also shown a rise in the water level. So if the rise in this water level were due to an outside air pressure increase, well, then the control chamber should have seen the same rise in water level. But the control condition had no change in the water level, suggesting that the outside air pressure did not change. Therefore, that leaves us with a change in the inside air pressure. And the suggestion here then for Hales was the inside air pressure was decreased because the plant was absorbing something from the air. Again, the inside air pressure was reduced because the plant absorbed something from the air in the chamber. The control condition allowed us to rule out the possibility of an outside air pressure change. It had to be some change inside the chamber. And that change had to be in the direction of decreasing the pressure. And what would do that if the plant were absorbing something from the air? And so Hales gathered evidence that plants were interacting with the air, they were absorbing something from the air, and the chemists, later chemists, would understand that something would have carbon atoms in it. We now know it to be carbon dioxide. It's a gas that's in the air, and plants are absorbing this gas as a source of carbon to make sugar, glucose. Water is also a critical component in this process. Now, the idea that plants were absorbing carbon dioxide from the air has implications about plant structure. There must be holes through which the gas, the carbon dioxide, enters the plant. In fact, if you take a look at this picture here, we have a leaf here. We've turned upside down. And if you can visualize this, the underside of the leaf has tiny little holes through which carbon dioxide enters. Now, to make a visualization of this, that's what these pictures are here. What you can do is you can take nail polish and paint a little section of the leaf with nail polish. Let the nail polish dry, and then peel the nail polish off. We don't want the plant anymore. We want the nail polish. Put the nail polish underneath the microscope, and you can see tiny little holes. They're called stomata, and these are the entry points for carbon dioxide from the air. So, if plants were absorbing carbon dioxide, scientists suspected there must be portals, there must be holes through which CO2 enters the plant. And so to test the idea that carbon dioxide entry through the stomata is necessary for glucose production, a guy by the name of Julius Sachs simply tried to block the holes, block the stomata, and he used wax on the underside of the leaf. So here's our thinking structure. If CO2 entry through stomata is necessary for glucose production and we block stomata with wax, then there should be no glucose production. And in fact, that's what Sachs found, that if you block the stomata, the plant can no longer make sugar and the leaf will die. So at this stage in our understanding from the work of Van Helmont and Hales, we have the idea that plants are using two simple types of ingredients in their environment: water molecules and carbon dioxide molecules from the air. And these two substances are used to construct glucose molecules, a sugar molecule. The process is called photosynthesis, but it's striking that it's just these two simple ingredients that plants are utilizing. They're not using large quantities of soil for growth, rather water and a substance from the air.